Welcome to Catholic Ed for All, your weekly insight into topics of special education in Catholic schools. My name is Dr. Raul Escarpio, and I invite you to join me each week as we learn how to be more inclusive in Catholic schools and continue to live out St. John Paul II's message of open wide the doors to Christ. Many thanks go out to RCL Benziger, who is generously sponsoring this podcast. RCL Benziger enriches the worldwide Catholic community by providing the most engaging and highest quality resources, programs, and services rooted in the rich and diverse tradition of the Catholic faith. And now, on to our show. On the show today, I am joined by Dr. Janette Boazman, Associate Professor and Chair for the Education Department at the University of Dallas. Hello, Janet. Welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, Raul.
Oh, you're welcome. My first person that says delighted. I'm very excited about that. Janet, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am now the chair of the Department of Education at University of Dallas and an associate professor of education. University of Dallas is oftentimes not recognized as a Catholic university from people outside of our community here because it doesn't really have a Catholic name. It has more of a secular name, but University of Dallas is a very Catholic university. And I actually have been teaching in Catholic schools for quite a while. If we include the time that I spent going to Catholic schools, I've been in Catholic schools for 29 years now.
Wow.
At some capacity, either as a student or a teacher in a classroom in a Catholic school or at a Catholic university. Working with principals in the Catholic diocese and working with teachers who want to teach in the Catholic school or in public school. I am married. I live in Dallas, obviously. I have a gifted son who is somebody that we thought would be in sciences or mathematics. But 2 years into his college education, he decided that he had a calling to the priesthood. So he was just ordained a transitional deacon. Next year, he will be a priest.
Praise God. Fantastic. Congratulations, Janet. You must be so thrilled.
We are thrilled.
And a gifted priest, no less. Can you imagine the hearts he's going to change? Can you imagine? Through God's...
Yes, that's part of what I talk about is if we don't meet the needs of gifted students in our Catholic classrooms, then we're going to be missing out on some of our important Catholic leaders probably in the next generations.
Well, by the grace of God, there's a special place in my heart for families of future priests. So you definitely have all our prayers. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you.
All right, Janet. So briefly, what does an associate professor and chair at the University of Dallas do on a daily basis?
Well, during the school year, of course, we teach a full load of classes. And I teach principles of elementary education, as well as math methods and science methods for elementary educators. And I also teach an education evaluation. That's our assessment course.
Mm-hmm.
And I teach a class on the nature and needs of gifted learners for undergraduates, which is kind of unusual in the undergraduate education. We don't usually see a lot of gifted programming for students in their undergraduate programs. So that's something really neat that our students get to take with them and go out into the schools with that knowledge already as an early teacher. The chairman gets to write a lot of reports.
Yes, they do.
And they also work with the state on regulation and deans and other people across the state who are in other universities. And it's an exciting position to have. We just kind of keep things rolling.
Absolutely. And the buck stops with you usually if you're the chair, right?
Yes, absolutely.
In a good way and in a bad way. It's always this is
Yeah.
always there. I'm happy to hear about the undergraduate gifted course. I'm in a teacher prep program myself, and one of the needs that the students are always talking about is the need to work with students who are gifted. So I'm happy to see that that's there. So
You know, one of the things that I noticed, Raul, is I'm getting feedback from my students that, especially if they came from Catholic schools, that they don't really understand what gifted is. I had a couple of students who came to me that didn't really understand what it meant for a student to be gifted until they took this course. And even though we talked about giftedness in the regular classrooms, they were kind of, their eyes were wide open when they took this class. So that was kind of exciting for me.
I would imagine so. I would imagine so because there's a lot of misconceptions about what's gifted. So without further ado, let's address those misconceptions. Let's talk giftedness, and especially
Okay.
what determines whether a child is gifted or not. And you and I were already going on a little back and forth before the show even started. So let's talk about it. What determines whether a child is gifted or not?
Well, in today's education climate, and just what we know from research is that you really can't look at giftedness as a single dimension in students. The IQ is a place that we begin. It's one point of data that we use, and it's often a starting point. So let's just talk IQ for a minute in identification. When we look at a student's IQ and we put this IQ on the bell curve, on a normal curve, we're looking at the mean being 100, an IQ of 100.
Okay.
And each standard deviation away from that mean is 15 points.
Right.
So you would have one standard deviation above the mean being 115, two standards being 130, three standards 145, and four standards 160, and so on. You get it.
Yes.
So when we look at a person's IQ, typically out in the circles that look at giftedness or we evaluate gifted students, historically it has been talked about as 130 being that point where we look at students and identify them as gifted. So there have been several models that have been put out there by different researchers about identification and how we look at IQ and how we define what a gifted student is. And there isn't one definition for us to follow. There is a definition that's put out by the federal government. There's a definition that's put out by National Education or National Association for Gifted Children. And then there are 50 other definitions for each state in the union. So a lot of those 50 definitions are based off of what the federal government says as a definition in the Marlins report, and what the National Association for Gifted Children define as gifted. And those include very broad categories for giftedness. The model that I look at, and many, many other researchers look at, is a model from Francois Garnier, a Canadian researcher. And he has taken this idea that gifts and talents are totally different things. Because often we hear those terms used interchangeably, gifts and talents. My child is gifted. We often hear that my child is gifted and talented, or my child is gifted, or this child is talented. But what do we mean by that? Those are kind of terms that are used interchangeably. So Garnier tells us that gifts are those things that are innate to everybody. They're God-given traits or abilities. And really, when you look at Garnier's model, it's a very, very, very inclusive model because everybody is born with innate abilities. God creates everybody to have some ability. So if you're picturing this on the left-hand side of a screen, you have a list of inherent traits that someone would have. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you would have a list of talents that someone could have, right? Or if we're talking about it not in gifted and talented terms, but in just general terms, those are competencies. So you have innate abilities in everybody, and we have competencies in everybody, or that everybody can develop. So that is a very inclusive way to look at identification of gifted students. Now, when we talk about giftedness, we're talking about the top 10% of people who have a certain ability, and then the top 10% of those who develop those competencies. So Gagne's model tells us that when we are identifying students, when we're looking at giftedness, we're looking at the top 10% of potential. What's there in the raw material? And then when we're identifying or labeling talented, we're looking at the top 10% of those capacities or capabilities that have been developed, those people who are performing at a very, very high level. Now, between those two lists, between the right side and the left side, is a developmental path. Everybody has a developmental path that they move on as they grow and mature. So impacting that developmental path are internal catalysts and external catalysts. So internal catalysts might be something like the personality or the temperament or the motivation that a person has. And then the external catalysts that bring about that movement towards talent development might be our schools, our teachers, the organizations that we have for our students, the parenting that they have, the socioeconomic status, the ethnicity, and the support structures in the culture. A person can have innate gifts, innate abilities at a very, very high level, but those gifts, depending on how their developmental path is impacted across their lifetime, across the years that they're developing, may never turn into talents or that performance or that capability at a high level. So it's up to us as teachers. And in our Catholic schools, it's up to us to develop this whole child. Now, I've been talking a lot, Raul, and I have another model that I really think applies to the Catholic schools very, very well. And it includes that talent development model that Gagne tells us about. Would you like me to talk about this other model a little bit? It includes developing friendship and integrity of life.
Okay.
Okay. So through my graduate studies and working with a wonderful professor named Michael Saylor, he used to be at the University of North Texas as one of the deans, and now he's the dean of Eastern Michigan University. When I was his graduate student, he was working on a model of gifted and thriving. Now, Mike Saylor is, he's a Catholic and a very devout Catholic. And he and I clicked very well when I was studying because we have similar beliefs. And when he was working on this model, it became very, very interesting to me because I have such a passion for our Catholic schools and what we do in our Catholic schools. And he said it's more than just talent development. It has to do with character development and integrity of life. And when you have that talent development, that character and that integrity of life, then you move towards thriving across the lifespan and away from wasting. So he took Gagne's model and said it's more than just this talent development. We see talented in the world, very, very talented people that aren't thriving in their life. The Bernie Madoff, he's very talented, but didn't thrive across his life. Our sports figures who are very talented and not thriving because of troubles that they're having, entertainers, and the like. So he said there has to be something much more important than just the talent development. And he, through the studies that we did, developed this idea that there is a character that has to be developed, and this character is developed through important relationships, and the pathway towards that is through friendships, is what he calls. So he's saying we all have innate abilities. We have a talent development pathway. And we also have a pathway that leads us to character, and that pathway is the friendship pathway, the important relationships that we make. So for our students in our Catholic schools, it could be friends, it could be like-minded people, it could be our teachers, our pastors, our principals. If they're out working on their talent development in other areas of their life outside of our Catholic schools, it includes all of those people that they're meeting in those organizations. And then the uniqueness of what Catholic schools have to offer is this development of the integrity of life, this holiness. And that comes through the process, the developmental process of spirituality, having a spiritual connectedness. In a secular setting, I talk about it as having a connection or an idea that you are part of something much, much bigger. In our Catholic schools, of course, we can talk about the spirituality and the connection to God and what that means for our life in our development as we move towards a holy person or having an integral life.
So
the more of those you have, the more you're moving towards thriving and away from wasting in your life.
beautiful examples, Janet, beautiful examples. So when we're looking at all those great models and ideas that you've just described, what should curriculum look like for these students? And can you also add rigor? Because a lot of times there's confusion among not only Catholic school teachers, but all teachers, thinking that gifted students just need more work to make sure that their needs are met. Can you touch upon what the curriculum should look like for these students?
Raul, that's a good question. When I'm out in the Catholic schools or even our public schools, I hear teachers talking about not being able to give the students enough work. They complete their work very quickly and then they're ready for something else and they don't have enough worksheets or enough things for the students to do. And that's a good illustration of just kind of piling on the work for the students at the same level of where they're already at. So how we serve our students in our Catholic schools depends on the kind of program that you want to offer at your school or what your needs of your school are. So when you're developing a program or working towards meeting the needs of the the gifted students in your Catholic school, you want to kind of look at the community and look and see if your school would be a good place for a pull-out program, or if it would be you would better serve the gifted students of your school with an enrichment program, possibly a school within a school. Or I even challenge some superintendents and dioceses to think about having something of a magnet school for gifted students, and it could be, early elementary grades through a high school even. So there are a lot of different models for schools to use in serving populations and dioceses to use in serving population. But if we go to the more intimate setting, the classroom setting, or the school setting, meeting the needs of those students in the classroom doesn't mean just giving them more work. So you've assessed them and they've been identified as having special abilities. And Susan Weinbrenner, in her book, Teaching Gifted Students in Today's Classroom, does a great job of laying out a lot of ways that you can meet the needs of the gifted students without just giving them more of the same work to do. So what the curriculum would look like would be that it's advanced, that it is something that students are interested in doing. It could be individualized. And when we look at math, and a lot of times our math teachers don't want, or any of our teachers want to go into this idea of accelerating students. But in mathematics, that's the best way to meet the needs of the gifted student, because there's only so many times that an elementary student can, work on two-digit multiplication. And if they've mastered it, they've mastered it. They need to move on. So acceleration is the best way to meet the needs of gifted students in our classrooms. Now, that being said, acceleration doesn't necessarily mean that you are pushing them to the next grade or grade skipping. The Bell and Blank Center at the University of Iowa has put out a couple of publications. One is A Nation Deceived, and then the follow-up to that is called A Nation Empowered. And The Nation Deceived was the first one that came out that talked about how we're kind of letting down our gifted students and not meeting their needs. And in that publication, they list 18 different ways to accelerate students. And only one of them is grade skipping. So if you're interested in acceleration without grade skipping, that would be a great resource. The follow-up to it, A Nation Empowered, has come several years after that initial publication of Nation Deceived, and it includes several pieces of research that have come out on how we're serving our gifted students and what we're doing, what the research tells us. And they've upped that to 20 different ways to accelerate students. So acceleration is one way, and it doesn't have to be just grade skipping, because we all know that that social and emotional construct is very, very important in the consideration of what we do with our gifted students. Because of that asynchronous development, they're often cognitively much more advanced than they are emotionally and socially. So we have to take those things into consideration. Now, if we're going to do an enrichment program, that's another way that you can meet the needs of students in your school or in your regular classroom. And enrichment could be taking a deeper dive, letting them go a little bit deeper. So if you're talking outside of the mathematics curriculum, say for instance in social studies or in English language arts, you differentiate the curriculum. You might do some ability grouping with them. And I know a lot of times there is a stigma or some resistance to doing some ability grouping, but we know that our gifted kids thrive when they have the ability to be grouped together and have people around them who are like-minded. So, and that relationship with those people helps bring about happiness and opening those psychological pathways that aid in learning. So those things are important to our gifted kids. Now, if we talk about rigor in the classroom, I kind of touched on it a little bit in talking about it's not just giving more work, it's giving challenging work.
The right work.
So the right work, right. So when students are in your classroom and they've already mastered the curriculum that you're teaching, some of them already kind of knowing what you're going to teach, they need to have something that's more rigorous, something that's going to challenge them in the right way. So that looks like project-based learning a lot of times, and it could be related to an interest that the student has. We know that if there's a higher interest in an area, that a student's going to take on that work, and gifted students like to continue working on something until they've mastered it. So that's what the rigor is going to look like in a classroom. It's not just more work, it's a challenge for them that can be applied to a real-life setting in a situation where they are interested in that learning.
Fantastic. Jana, you and I can go back and forth on curriculum for these students, and I think I will try to have you back down the road so we can talk about specific curriculum objectives that we can work with students. But wow, what a thrilling conversation and enlightening for me, because I'm going to be using a lot of Gagne from now on when I talk about it. Janet, before I let you go, can you please just finish us up by saying what should Catholic special education and in gifted students exceptional education look like?
Well, first thing that, we need to think about in our Catholic schools, we want to have an inclusive environment. We don't want to have these silos of students who are identified and put into different programs. And we want it oftentimes to be an inclusive environment. And sometimes that keeps us from identifying the gifted students. And I think by using Gagne's model, casting that wide net, and going beyond just looking at IQ, that we're going to capture an inclusive student body. So if we use that one IQ of 130 rule, the student who's at 129 is still going to need some services, right? They're still very smart. They're still very capable. So when we cast that wider net and we use other factors that help us look at the students in a more dimensional way, things like teacher nominations and parent nominations, self-nomination, peer nomination. We look at portfolio possibly, and look at them in more than one dimension. I think that's going to make it a more inclusive program in our Catholic schools. That being said, if somebody is identified and they're not fitting in with what's going on in the gifted program that you've developed for your school, there needs to be a way for them to furlough out or leave that program. So that needs to be taken into consideration. So with that being said, I think that, that our students need to know that they should be in a program that best fits their needs. We all want the same thing for our kids. We want them to be happy and healthy and in good schools and making friends that bring about happiness in their life and bring them to positive character development. And so, I think that being inclusive and helping students understand that they're in the right program, whether it's a traditional education program or it's a gifted education program or an enrichment program or whatever it is, that's the right program for them. So our schools need to focus on having the right program for the kids.
Fantastic. What a great conversation. I like the whole idea of silos that you were talking about and how we need to move away from that. Janet, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. I wish you nothing but prayers and blessings as you continue your mission at the University in Dallas and educating the rest of us on gifted learning and what it should look like with all these models. I hope you have a great day and God bless you.
Thank you, Raul. It's been a delight.
Well, that's it for this week. If this podcast was a blessing to you, can you please head over to iTunes and subscribe and give us a review or a rating? It really does help other Catholic educators find the podcast and use it as a resource. Thanks again to the amazing people at RCL Benziger for generously sponsoring this podcast. Check out their new resource for Catholic schools, Blessed Are We, Faith in Action, which enables teachers to share the love of Christ with children who have special needs. Visit rclbenziger.com to learn more. Join me again next time as we continue to advance God's kingdom by including all of God's children in Catholic schools and faith formation. Until then, this is Dr. Raul Escarpio. Thanks for listening, and may God bless your day.